Hi, Dave Holmes here from Knox United Church. I'm going to start the theme for this particular sermon with a couple of quotations. The first is from Richard Rohr. The true mystic is always both humble and compassionate, for she knows that she does not know. And the second is from Anne Lamott. You can safely assume that you've created God in your own image when it turns out that God hates all the same people you do. The theme for this particular sermon is about the unknowability and the mystery of God, the realization that God is and always will be beyond our understanding. A negative way to speak about the same theme would be to talk about idolatry, which is the delusion, the pretense that we can understand God, that we can have God all boxed up and that we can be right about God. In Paul's words in the scripture we'll be reading shortly, or that I'll be reading right away, idolatry is worshiping an image formed by the art and imagination of mortals. And I think that image could be physical. It could also be mental. So here's the scripture. It's from Acts 17, 22 to 29. It's Paul speaking before the gathered intellectuals of Athens in the Areopagus. Then Paul stood in front of the Areopagus and said, Athenians, I see how extremely religious you are in every way. For as I went through the city and looked carefully at the objects of your worship, I found among them an altar with the inscription, to an unknown God. What therefore you worship as unknown, this I proclaim to you. The God who made the world and everything in it, God who is Lord of heaven and earth, does not live in shrines made by human hands, nor is God served by human hands, as though God needed anything, since God himself gives to all mortals life and breath and all things. From one ancestor God made all nations to inhabit the whole earth, and God allotted the times of their existence and the boundaries of the places where they would live, so that they would search for God, and perhaps grope for God and find God, though indeed God is not far from every one of us. For in God we live and move and have our being, as even some of your own poets have said. For we too are God's offspring. Since we are God's offspring, we ought not to think that the deity is like gold or silver or stone, an image formed by the art and imagination of mortals. So, just prior to the start of our passage, we hear that Paul is disturbed by the tendency of the Athenians to worship idols. And in some ways, his speech is a challenge to idolatry. But idolatry seems like a pretty archaic thing, not something we do now, surely. We don't worship images made of stone or metal. I've been taught, though, that whatever we give our lives to is functionally what we worship. So, do we give our lives to work, to making money, to building careers? Then money and career is to some extent our God, the God that we worship. I know that it is not an easy thing to name what it is we give our lives to. It's complex, and we might hide the truth from ourselves. So think for a minute. To what are you giving your life right now? Do you even know? As I was researching for this, I read another quote. It's attributed to different people. I don't know who might have actually said it. First, anyway, we stray into idolatry when we use what we ought to worship or worship what we ought to use. Does that spark anything in you? Paul puts it this way. We shouldn't think that the divine nature is like gold or silver or stone, an image fashioned by human art and imagination. I suppose that might be a physical image, as I said before, but I think it also is probably a mental image created by human art or imagination. Perhaps the image of a white-bearded white man in the sky on a throne. Perhaps the image of a divine judge who, like Santa Claus, keeps track of our actions to see if we deserve presents or coal, heaven or hell. The whole image of God as male through all the centuries. Whatever your mental image of God might be, it is ultimately a creation of your mortal imagination, or something you picked up from somebody else's mortal imagination. Whatever our theology, whatever our belief structure, in the end, it is a construction of mortal art and imagination, isn't it? Now, on the one hand, as a student of theology, I would say that art and imagination aren't bad things. I find good theology to be extremely helpful. It is as a finger pointing to the moon, or it's like a telescope that allows us to see more clearly. If we didn't have the finger pointing, the telescope to bring things into focus, the wisdom of the astronomer to help us understand, we might not even notice the moon or appreciate what it is. But the finger pointing to the moon is not the moon. And we must never confuse our partial ideas about God for the actuality of the divine. If we forget how much more amazing God is than our theology, we stray into idolatry. In his speech, Paul is speaking to people who are religiously different. Yeah, I suppose he's trying to convert them, and that may not be something we want to follow Paul in. But I'm amazed in this at how he lifts up the common ground between himself and those he thinks of as worshiping idols. He says, first of all, that God is the creator of all of us. We are one human family. And he assures his listeners that God does not live in shrines or churches and does not need human hands for service. God doesn't somehow need us to belong to the right club or follow the right rules or do the right rituals. On the contrary, as Paul says to those religiously different people, God is near to all of us. All of us live and move and have our being in God. We are all God's offspring. Paul is really making no distinction at all between himself and his religiously different viewers. We might seek after God, and we do, the images of someone groping in the dark. But God is all around us, near at hand. We live in God as a fish lives in water. We're all groping in the dark. And God is surrounding and loving and lifting all of us alike. Whatever our creed, we are God's offspring. Because while Paul is absolutely unapologetic about preaching the gospel, he is aware that none of us have the full picture. What an amazingly humble and respectful position for him to take. I think, too, of what he wrote in 1 Corinthians in the passage about love that Greg quoted last week and that we often read at weddings, about love being the one essential component of our faith. As part of that passage, Paul reminds us that we know only in part. All our understanding, all our theology, all our ethics, these are all partial, through a glass darkly, as the words say. The only truly heavenly thing we can grasp here and now is love. For me, that is hugely important. And to finish this off for today, let me just offer 2 examples of why I think this is so important. First, it means that growing faith will often feel like losing faith. Have you ever felt like you've lost your faith? Lost your belief in God? Lost your respect for the teaching of the church? I certainly have, several times in fact. I have come to recognize that experience of loss as a marker of growth. And I've come to recognize, I think, that what is failing in these experiences is not my faith in God, but rather a failing of my ideas about God. And that stands to reason. The more I am able to connect with and experience God for real, the less adequate my ideas about God will seem. I hope that makes sense. Growing faith feels like losing faith because we need to continually outgrow our ideas about God. The second example is in terms of interfaith relationships. Some folks I know speak to me as if Muslims and Christians or Hindus and Sikhs worship different gods, simply because our ideas about God, or the way we express our ideas, or the rituals we use to connect are different. As if God is nothing more than the ideas or words we use to describe God. But again, the finger pointing at the moon is not the moon. And the religions that enable us to connect with God are simply pointers, telescopes, star charts. God is the one to whom we point. And I've been astonished to find that the deepest and most faithful practitioners of different religions bear a striking resemblance to one another. I think we may not be in competition with each other as different religions, any more than the oboes in an orchestra are in competition with the violins. I don't think it's God that's different. I think it's just us. I'll leave it here for today. I would love to hear how you respond to this. In a sentence, I'll say it this way. The purpose of our religion is not to know or agree about God. It's to know God, who is always more than we could ever know. It's not knowledge, but relationship that is the key. Thanks for listening. Amen.